Hello, and welcome. I'm in agreement with Franz Kafka. Asking questions is the most important thing, because if you don't ask, how will you know? I've always taken a Socratic approach in my attempt to try to understand people and perspectives, because it's not necessarily the answer to a question that reveals most about the person or the situation. It's often the reaction to the question that informs you. You can get a pretty solid read on someone with, just micro-expressions, or the way they react instinctively. Like the other day, I was walking past this market, and there was this line of people outside queuing for supplies. And they were all standing a few meters apart, and no one was talking, and many were wearing masks. But outside the market, there was a testing booth, and they stated they were testing for you-know-what. It was a voluntary testing station. In the booth, it was manned by one man and one woman. So I approached the booth, and I asked them, I said, "What's the test you're using?" So I was very polite, I was very cordial in my manner, because I was interested if samples were going to be used with any particular form of testing, like the RT-PCR test, or the antigen test, or both, or a different method. Essentially how the testing was going to be conducted, but they couldn't answer on the testing, but I was curious. I have friends and I know other people that work in healthcare and the media and the local government and so on, but it seems like a cone of silence has descended. I can't get any clarification on things, especially on the testing itself, or on the validity or the accuracy of it. How many are asymptomatic, how many are false positives, and so on. It seems that no one is really reporting on it, except in very vague terms, or on the processes. So my questions to these people at the booth then concern the process, or who I could touch base with further to discuss the lines of authority or management, or even where the samples themselves are being sent. So, to me the questions seem relevant, and in my mind it's always the question that's of prime importance, as that is what opens the door. So my demeanour was calm, it was rational, but theirs increasingly was not. So my questions, they seemed to evoke a fairly hostile response, right from the get-go. And their responses back to me, they were quite curt, and almost accusatory, which at the time I found quite humorous. But the fact my questions, maybe they revealed a lack of knowledge on their part. It seemed to irk them. Or maybe it was because I wasn't following some designated process. Because what I'm seeing now, what I'm hearing now from a lot of people is that there's a lot of secondary issues coming out of the shutdown, domestic violence, child abuse, health issues, which I'm hearing now from people I know on the front line. But you look at people, most people are not their own best company to begin with. And now they're scared. Now they're frustrated. Now they're living on top of each other. And we're not hearing about the fallout from that. And it's ugly. And people are suffering. I also know many people who should be up for, elective surgery or diagnostic testing treatment currently, but that's either been cancelled or they're just too scared to talk to a healthcare professional. So the lines of communication, they've been cut off. So there's no real clarity. A lot of qualified voices now, they're being censored. Anyway, there were several police officers in the vicinity, and one of the testers at the booth, they eventually signalled to them. So one of the officers, he came over and he engaged with me. And right from the start, his body language, it was fairly confrontational. So I explained my intention to him and why I was asking the questions. But the manner in which the officer and others at the booth were interacting with me was incongruent with my manner. I was calm. I was non-confrontational. They weren't. Yet the strong inference was that I was the one that was out of control. Even though, once again, my manner was calm, my manner was rational. I wasn't in anyone's way, I wasn't holding the line up. But the people manning the booth, they then asked the officers, "Could you please deal with this?" So again, I simply reiterated my intentions calmly, just to provide assurance. But the officer, he then fronted up to me. He took a step towards me, and he was taller than I was, so he was trying to impose himself into my physical space. So I stepped forward into his, which seemed to take him off guard. But that's just a natural reaction. And so I started speaking, in terms of specific legalities that, Even though specific liberties and rights have been somewhat curtailed during these last few weeks, that we still have centuries of common law precedents. We still have rights protecting our freedoms as citizens dating back over 800 years. That our traditions, both legal and constitutional traditions, emphasize freedom and liberty first and foremost. That even in the crisis, it's vital we remember that constitutional heritage. That was the essential gist of it. I was more specific with him, but he could see that I knew my rights, and his demeanour changed. They could see that I knew the rule of law. And the manner in which I spoke was forthright, it was rational, and there was no way I was backing up. It's like talking to a crim. Talking to a criminal, you speak the language, and it taps into something else in the brain. So once their demeanour changed, everyone else just fell silent. They were looking to the officers to lead. And it's not the first time I've been in a similar situation with authority and with hostile people. I've often found that the words, they can neutralise a potential threat better than violence or anger ever can. So, I looked around and I said, I wish you all a good day, and I continued on my way. Positively Kafkaesque. That's a term that gets thrown around a lot. Some take it as meaning a disorientating Orwellian maze of bureaucracy and invisible forces, where nothing makes sense. Where if you step out of line, you're an enemy of the state, but you're never quite sure of where the lines are, or where vague allegations are levelled against you, but you're never told what the crime is. Where the illusion of fear is always present, the illusion of authority, the knock on the door in the middle of the night. Franz Kafka, he said it right, that if a man has his eyes bound, you can encourage him as much as you like to stare through the bandage, but he'll never see anything. Kafka is one of my favourite writers. In Kafka's novel The Trial, the character of Joseph K. He wakes up one morning to a couple of policemen in his room. He gets charged with a crime, but he's never told what the crime is, and then he's put on trial. And other people, they suffer because of the decisions that Joseph makes and because of the questions that he asks, even though he is acting rationally and logically in the face of something quite surreal and incomprehensible. So it plays out like a living nightmare. And in order for Joseph K. to cope with the situation, he convinces himself that there must be a process, and that he just can't see it. So he tries to work within the process, but it's an endless maze, where the unseen goalposts just keep shifting. Joseph K., he does himself no favours by trying to work within the system. By trying to act in a logical manner within this nightmare, it only aggravates the situation. By swimming with the tide, he's only inviting more pain and injustice to be visited upon him. So he makes the mistake of starting with what is acceptable, rather than what is right. And Joseph K., he's told during the trial that you don't need to accept everything as true, you only have to accept it as necessary. And Joseph replies, well, that's a depressing view. The lie has now been made into the rule of the world. Kafka's work, it was always a deep dive into the experience of alienation, and he also had a great knack at holding a mirror up to the reader. And more than anything, his writings were a critique on the individual. A common theme often being the consequences of man's failure to act, but also his complicity in his own suffering. As Kafka said, if the book we are reading does not wake us as with a fist hammering on our skull, why then do we read it? Because most people live in fear. All they care about is making the present moment tolerable. As long as you're okay in the here and now, then they're willing to compromise. They'll compromise their freedoms, their privacy, their dignity. They don't stop to think about tomorrow. And I've known many men who have suffered great trauma. At their core is a vacuum. It's like a bottomless void. And these men are terrified of facing it. So they're caught between worlds. They want to escape the past. And they also fear the future, which makes the present unbearable. They're also bringing the past with them into the present, which then determines their future. So it's no different to an addict. So they do whatever it takes to escape it, to escape the pain, drugs, violent crime, self-harming. Yeah, and most people are the same. They try to fill the void inside them with the things they buy, or likes on social media, or chasing dopamine highs. All it does is make the individual emptier than before. So there is no meaning or purpose to their lives other than making the present bearable. So we've lost perspective. We've lost touch with what is meaningful to us. But I've seen it, oftentimes, that the more a person tries to escape pain, the more pain it creates. And Kafka said, you can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world, but perhaps this holding back is the one suffering you could avoid. In Kafka's Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa, he wakes one morning to find he's transformed into a giant insect. Gregor, he's a travelling salesman. He lives with his parents and with his sister. He provides for all of them with his job, because the family, they're saddled with debt from the father's collapsed business, and it's up to Gregor to bring home the bacon. And when Gregor wakes up, he's initially shocked by the fact that he's turned into a giant insect, but rather hilariously, he's more worried about missing the train and being late for work than the fact he's now a giant bug. Because he sees his worth as just being solely defined by his job and by his role as breadwinner for the family, for a family that does not value him. And when his family find out about his transformation, they confine Gregor to his room. They don't want to know him. But we come to learn that this metamorphosis is really like a revealing of Gregor's true self, and also of how others truly see him. Because he has no friends, he has no life. His family, they treat him like a walking ATM machine. People don't respect or value Gregor. They just take him for granted. And he hates his job, and he's disrespected at work. And now that he's transformed, the mask has fallen. And his family, they now treat him with open contempt. They ignore him. They just feed him scraps. But instead of feeling resentment towards him, he initially feels shame. Shame that he can't provide for his family anymore. Because he sees himself now as a burden to the family, as do they. And he can't speak, he can't taste food, and he no longer has any freedom or connection to anyone. So he finally dies, either of starvation or by suicide. And he sees it as doing a favour for his family. So the reader, they can't help but feel compassion for Gregor. He's always been very hard on himself. He tells himself if he dies that no one will care and that he's worthless. And the way his family treat him, it's inhuman. Kafka said, one of the first signs of the beginning of understanding is the wish to die. Of course, death can take on many meanings. Now, most people, they're asleep at the wheel. It's like they're driving in reverse. And they're convinced that they're in control of the vehicle, but they're not. Experience equals perspective. A child that is abused or neglected, that initial pain, it leads to a distorted view of the world and of other people, and it's their only frame of reference. Those beliefs, they then become self-fulfilling. And at a subconscious level, that child then interprets every interaction, every situation through that distorted lens. So the future is then dictated by the past. So every destructive act, every episode of self-harming, it's a conditioned subconscious response. The brain and the body, it's running on overdrive. And it's ready to fight, ready to lash out. And it's only when we become present in the current moment and aware of those conditioned responses that we finally have autonomy over our lives. It always brings a smile to my face when I see a young man realize for the first time that he actually has a choice. That he actually has a say in his own life. Even if it's the choice to walk away, or the choice to stay when others are extending their support or guidance to him. If you saw a young man slashing his arm up, or headbutting a door, or punching himself in the face for no discernible reason, you might think that's a bit odd. It's self-harming. But it was at one point in that young man's life a survival mechanism, a means of coping with trauma. Because he didn't have any other means of self-soothing, of escape. And when he experienced this trauma as a child, he went into shutdown mode. No emotion. He went numb. But that is a carryover effect. He stays numb. But as men, we need to be able to identify certain emotions in order to identify what is harmful and what is not. We need to be able to identify stress. Need to be able to express when things feel unsafe, so we can maintain healthy boundaries. And also figure out if the reaction we are having in the current moment is appropriate, or is it a reaction from something in the past. Because I've lost count of the number of times I've asked a man why he acted out violently in the moment. Their response is typically a confused shrug. They have no idea. Well, sometimes they'll say it, but they're so embarrassed to decide the reason. He looked at me funny. He was giving me the evils, bro. So it comes down to dysregulation, the body and the mind. So perception, it gets distorted. And he sees disrespect where there is none. He sees danger or risk in everyday situations. But a man needs to be able to separate and identify things, like the importance of his own needs. Because men are far too willing to compromise their needs and their time, their labour, or their integrity to satisfy other people, or just so they can get a pat on their head for being a good little utility. But we're playing with fire, because the boy we abuse and neglect today will not be the same man tomorrow. And I've seen it. When men suffer, we all pay the price. And Kafka said about love, he said, "You are the knife I turn inside myself. That, my dear, is love." But there's a recipe. There's a recipe to making a man break. I've seen it in high-stress environments. You make a man unsure of where he stands. You muddy the waters with a lack of clarity or with little to no information. And then you take away his personal autonomy, his sense of control. That man will break. He's confused. He's frustrated. He's frightened. But he's not sure of what. And there's no way for him to predict his future because he is uncertain of the present. He feels trapped. He feels alienated. He feels victimized. I've seen that kind of impotent rage and confusion explode into very volatile situations. When in truth, those situations were easily avoidable, and all the warning signs were there. I've also seen that when you scare a man enough, he will be so afraid that he will ignore his own gut instinct. He will stop asking questions. He will ignore facts and any other opinions, no matter how valid. Kafka said, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." Because he recognized that all systems and governments stemmed from human nature, and that any institutionalized injustices and abuses derive from us, from our fears, from our convictions, our own pride or resentment. So he saw that there is no invisible bureaucracy, only us, operating at the most base primitive level. Kafka said, "I am in chains. Please, don't touch my chains." Because right now, I see a lot of references in the media currently that are very similar to war language, terms that are typically used in times of war. Because some people are scared. Others are very angry over the lack of clarity. And others are more interested in making sure their neighbours conform to government guidelines and relish that sense of power that they get from informing on others. It gives them a sense of control and autonomy in the face of uncertainty. Other people simply conform rather than swimming against current. Because the issue is so heavily charged, and they don't want to be seen as acting against the greater good. And Gregor sacrificed his humanity to make others happy, just like so many other men. And he's alienated. He's alienated from his family, from society, from himself. Because in truth, he had no personal identity to lose, as his identity was only as a utility. Now he can't even provide that. So he's consigned to the scrap heap. Prior to his metamorphosis, he existed on the margins of society and he was tolerated. Now he's only viewed as a burden. Even his death was a non-event. His family feel relief that he's dead, and they celebrate with a picnic. It's like he never existed. In one of Kafka's stories called In the Penal Colony, the narrator, he sees a man who is about to be executed, but the man is unsure of what crime he's been charged with. But the narrator, he describes the man as looking so submissively dog-like that it seemed as if he would only need to be whistled for when the execution was due, for it to begin. And Kafka also said, "You are free. That is why you are lost." Because, for many people, freedom is too great a responsibility. So, they look to the government, or they look to others, to lead them. And they're more than happy to make whatever sacrifices necessary for the wonderful privilege of being led. Like a dog on a leash. We used to be part of a tribe. Our survival and our progress, it depended on one another. Now much of that has just been replaced by government, by technology. There is no real community anymore, and we're very divided. Our social networks have essentially moved online, where non-conformity or any questioning of the narrative is met with social exclusion. Now, the family structure, it's been destroyed, with divorces, with single motherhood. Now, children are now raised by their peers as opposed to their parents. So guidance from elders and male mentorship has all but disappeared from young boys' lives. So we just get a conveyor belt of dysfunction. And it almost seems like personal responsibility has become a relic of the past. Franz Kafka. Franz and his father, they didn't get on very well, to say the least. Kafka, he wrote a letter to his father at the age of 36, and he called him out for being an abusive tyrant, and he blamed him for many of his bad experiences in life. And it's an amazing letter. His analysis of his father's psychology and the effects the abuse had on his life, they're very insightful. And Kafka, he wrote to his father, "You took on the quality that all tyrants have, whose rights are based on their own person and not on reason." He wrote how his father's judgments hampered his development, essentially to the point where he could barely complete a thought or task. So it filled him with self-doubt, and he never knew where he stood from one day to the next. His father would belittle anything that Franz showed interest in, and he'd become antagonistic to anything Franz did or suggested. So there was one rule for father and one rule for Franz, and what was okay for daddy was not okay for son. So Franz's world, it became disorientating. Instead of stability, there was emotional abuse, there was double standards, there was constant disapproval. So for Franz, it was like walking on eggshells. And Franz, he said of his father, "From your armchair, you ruled the world." Father was right, and everyone else was wrong. And it led to Franz being very submissive and very passive in his life. And he felt that everything he did or was said was wrong and shameful. And he said he expected at any moment for his father to come bursting through the door in the middle of the night and wrench him out of bed for some wrong he never committed. But Franz, he lived under the notion that daddy was always right. So for Franz, submission to authority came to mean love. If he could only please father, he would be accepted, no matter what the cost was to him personally. No sacrifice was too great. And children react. They react to their environment, to caregivers, because that's their window to the world. But shame and trauma, it can cripple a child's ability to see and experience the world in a realistic and healthy way. If everything that child does is wrong in the eyes of the parents, if one parent is authoritarian and the other parent enables this behavior by passively allowing it to happen, like Franz's mother did, then that child's reality, how they perceive the world, it's always going to be where every word, every action brings with it a heavy sense of shame, of being wrong. So Franz, he wrote, "I became unsure, even of the thing nearest to me, my own body." So Franz, in his later life, he became a virtual hypochondriac. He developed many physical ailments, and he eventually died of TB. Franz, he was ashamed that he never stood up to his father. He stated he felt like a disgrace for not standing up to him, and also for having failed his father's expectations. Expectations of perfection in the face of constant belittling and disapproval. Franz, he wrote, "Your undertone of anger and condemnation, it only makes me tremble less today because a child's sense of guilt has been replaced by insight into our helplessness, yours and mine." Franz, he talks of how being under his father's authoritarian control, it systematically destroyed him, and how it later played a major role in the destruction of the marriage and many relationships. Franz once wrote that, "From a certain point onward, there is no longer any turning back. That is the point that must be reached." And Franz, he suffered for most of his life. He struggled to find his voice. And when he spoke, he would stammer and stumble. And he found it very difficult to voice his needs and define his boundaries, so people took advantage of his passive nature. But through writing, he found his voice. And in his later years, he came to understand who he was and what he wouldn't compromise on. He came to realize that what he feared were illusions. The illusion of fear, the illusion of authority. And that compassionate curiosity and asking questions, as opposed to just blind compliance, that they were the most important things.